This is a photograph of the painting you're about to watch me make. I actually painted this image twice. This is the second version. I took much more time and worked indirectly. You can see a much greater degree of depth and detail, and in the background there are layers of glazes which create a lot of atmosphere. In this second version, I'm working on an 11 by 14 canvas. The canvas on this video is 12 by 16. You can tell the difference in the amount of background in each of the two paintings. I think that the 11 by 14 is a better composition. This is a photograph of the setup from which I did the painting. The canvas is covered with a wash of color called an imprimatura. My imprimatura was made from a mixture of Indian red, underpainting white, and liquid original. It is applied in a brushy manner but does not actually have texture. This layer must be allowed to dry thoroughly. My drawing was made with a water-soluble pencil. It's very important to use a good quality pencil. Don't use red or blue as they are too chromatic and they're too high staining. Try to use any sort of brown or perhaps even black. I start with the wipeout glaze. The glaze is made of burnt umber thinned with turbinoid. You can also use Gamsol or whatever you have. I brush it on very roughly. Try not to get it too wet. If it's too wet, it will start running down the canvas. If that happens, simply wipe it off and try it again using less turp. You also want it to be dark, not so dark you can't see the drawing, but dark enough so that there's a big value difference between the raw tone of the canvas and the wipeout glaze. My application of this glaze is very fast and fairly rough. Don't bother to try to smooth it out too much. Just make sure that it's evenly applied. I'm using a t-shirt rag and my finger to wipe out the larger areas on the pears, on the bricks as well, that are actually being struck by the light source. I only have one light source, and so this is not terribly complicated. Notice that I'm not touching the areas of any of the forms where the light does not directly strike. So if there is a cast shadow or a form shadow, I'm just not touching that. I'm basically mapping the simple light. Where does the light strike the objects and where does it not strike? I really like to use these t-shirt rags. I purchase boxes of them at the hardware store, take the box home, put the rags in my washing machine and wash them at least 2 or 3 times, as well as run them through the dryer in order to remove almost all of the lint. This is an important step. Don't skip it. The other option would be to simply use an old cut-up t-shirt that has been washed so many times that there's no longer any lint in it. If I make a mistake and wipe some area off where it shouldn't be wiped off, where it's in the shadow mass, then I simply pick up my same brush that I used to apply it and I reapply the wipeout glaze. It's a very forgiving process, so don't worry, do it, and if you need the practice, put the glaze back on and try it again. I continue to shift the rag around on my finger to get a clean spot on the rag so I can continue to successfully wipe off that wet glaze. During this entire process, I'm keeping an eye on the background because it's a large area of just the wet glaze. What I'm looking for is whether or not that glaze is starting to weep down the canvas. If it does at all, that means there's too much wetness to it. I'm using the brush to remove some of the glaze. You'll notice I'm wiping the brush off in between strokes. At this point, I'm wiping out very small areas, and so I have switched to a clean, dry brush, which will enable me to wipe out the stems. I don't want to let myself forget that the stems are actually being struck by the light, so I consider this important enough to bother with it. Anytime you run into a really small area or you want to clean up an edge, just grab a clean, dry brush and remove whatever wipeout glaze you feel that you need to. I'm not bothering to do any sort of wipeout on the background simply because it's going to be black and therefore there won't be any light. So I'm just leaving it dark. This also will help because it'll be nice and wet for when I apply the black paint. Make sure you also soften the edges of all of these areas where you go into shadow. Your finished wipeout should look something like this. We will now start to apply the opaque colors for the pears. Don't worry about matching my colors exactly, just mix greens that look like they belong on a pear. Mix your lightest value first. This is value number 1. Next, mix value number 3. This is your darkest light. Mix some of value 1 and some of value 3 to make value number 2. Try to keep value number 2 visually in the middle between 1 and 3. Value number 1 will be located where the highlights are on the pears. This is where the forms are most perpendicular to the light source. Value number 2 will be placed directly around the number 1 value. Value number 3 is your darkest light. You'll find that around the edges of the form, as well as the transition zone between the light mass and the shadow mass. I begin the application of opaque color using value number 1. You'll notice that it doesn't take place on a very large area of the pears. Later, I will come back and reapply more of this highlight color. Now I've moved on to value number 2. When doing the actual painting, I felt that value number 2 wasn't quite dark enough. I needed more of a value shift between number 1 and number 2. At this point, I also reached down and mixed in a little of value 3 into my value 2, darkening it just a little bit. I felt that this value shift was more noticeable and much more effective. I'm making sure to use enough paint to create an opaque layer on my canvas. My goal at this point is to locate all the values in their proper place and to get good coverage. Now I'm working again with my original number 2 value. I'm using it right outside the highlight to lighten wherever I feel I may have gone too dark with that mix between 2 and 3. And back to the number 3 value. As I come to the outside edge of the form and as I come to the transition zone right here where the form is just turning into the shadow mass, I'm using this darkest light. At this point, I'm starting to make a conscious effort to cover my original pencil lines. If I go over a bit, that'll be just fine because I'll come back and meet that edge with the black background. Again, I'm using the mixture of number 2 and 3 to get a middle tone within this light mass of the lower pear. Looking for opaque coverage, a good shift in values. I'm using a number 4 filbert. It's a little bit old, so the hairs are slightly splayed. I'm checking to make sure that my application is pretty well opaque. I felt that my darkest light wasn't quite dark enough, so to my number 3 value, I actually mixed in a little bit of my number 4 value. You'll notice that as I use it, particularly the transition tone between the light and the shadow mask, it really helps to turn the form. You'll see that throughout this painting, I very often will mix between two tones. I won't make a radical jump from something like a 4 to a 1, but I will go from one value to the one right next to it in order to get an in-between tone that I think will suit my purposes better. There you saw me just cover a little bit more of the watercolor pencil line. I continue, as I paint, to check for opaque coverage as well as policing the watercolor pencil lines. I really need to try to get those covered. Notice at this point that I'm not doing any blending. I'm just mosaicing in the various values where I think they need to be. Having wiped out my brush, I grabbed some more of that number 1 value, and now I'm going back into the lightest light areas and applying more paint and doing a little bit of blending. It's just at this point wet in wet painting. That simple stroke indicates a slight divot in the pear. These subforms become very important to what is a fairly lumpy, bumpy surface on these pears. It makes them look much more natural. I'm still working with the number 1 value. Notice how often I'm looking at the setup. It's critical to success. You really shouldn't make more than 3 or 4 strokes without looking at your reference, whether it's an actual setup or a reference photograph. Here I'm wiping my brush out before I start to go around and tap at the edges of the transitions from one value to another. This will soften the entire look. Now we will begin to work in the shadow mask. We'll start with only 2 values. Here I'm using the darker of the 2 values. It's what I call the zone of tangency, usually, or at least often, the darkest area of the shadow mask. I've been using the same number 4 filbert during the entire time I've been working with my green color. I'm switching now to the lighter of the two shadow mask colors. This is the number 4 value. I know it's hard to tell the difference between the two until they're right next to each other, but bear with me. Now you can see the difference between the number 4 and the number 5 value in this reflected light area. In the areas of greatest reflected light, I'll come back later and lighten them even more using simply yellow ochre. This will not only lighten them, it will warm them a little bit. If you look closely, in some areas, particularly in the shadow mask, you can still see the imprimatura showing through. I'll need to work on this to get better coverage. Again, I'm picking up my darker color to go back and reinforce that dark entry into the shadow mask area. When all your colors are pre-mixed like this, it's amazing how fast you can paint these pears. I'm going to tap in between each of my value shifts. This will give me a slightly blended look, but it won't destroy the shift between values. Every time I lower my brush in this section, I'm using a rag to wipe the excess paint out of the brush before tapping the surface again. I'm using a wiped out brush to affect the paint that's already on the surface, but I'm not applying more paint. The transition between the light mask and the shadow mask at the area of a cast shadow can be a little sharper than a form shadow, but it still has to be tapped and slightly fuzzy. Form shadows are caused by the form turning away from the source of the light. The light can't strike the surface if it's not facing in the general direction of the light source. You must tap along the seam between the light source and the shadow mask. It's very important that this area of transition be fuzzy. I'm tapping along the outside edge of each form to make sure that it's a soft area and that hopefully I've covered all of the watercolor pencil lines. I'm also ensuring that I have good opaque coverage and that none of my imprimatura is still showing through the pear surfaces. Having wiped out the brush again, I'm going back and tapping the transition areas between the lighter values, just softening them a little bit. Wiping the brush is very important, especially if you're going from the shadow mask into the light mask or vice versa. You don't want to transfer those values. Let's paint the background. I'm using just lamp black. Don't forget, I'm working on a wet surface. This makes things a lot easier. In the beginning of this part of the demonstration, I'm painting at normal speed of life. Later, I intend to speed up the film so that you won't have to sit through me doing an entire black background. And here we are at 4 times the speed of life. Keep your brush strokes very short, no longer than an inch, maybe an inch and a half. Try, although I don't always do it, try to start away from the forms and then carefully work up to the edge of the form. At some point in this, you'll see me switch to a little bit smaller brush. I believe it was a number 2 filbert that I switched to. You just want to make sure that you have good control. You will notice that one single coat of paint on a black background will not give you completely opaque coverage. If you want it to be completely opaque, you'll have to go back in for at least one more coat, possibly 2. Here's the switch to the smaller brush. Take your time when painting a background. It is important. If it's a black background like this one, you can even use it to slightly correct the edges of your form. You can shave something in a little bit if you need to, or level something up. But make sure that you're careful with it because, yeah, like anything else, you can mess it up. Try to avoid any beaded or textural edges. Make sure you don't have any big lumps of black paint. If nothing else, they'll take a long time to dry and they look bad. I'm tapping the edges again between the pear and the background, but I'm only doing it in the shadow mass area. I want a slightly fuzzy edge on the pears when they're in the darker shadow mass area. I want a sharp edge when it's in the light mass. Now I'm filling in the rest of the background. If you'll notice, I don't quite go to the edge. I find that it's messy during the day. I wind up getting black paint all over my hands if I pick the canvas up. But just at the very end of the day, I go back with more plain lamp black and I go all the way to the edge. That way it can dry without me putting my hands in it. Now I'm going to start to paint the bricks. I've mixed 5 values from light to dark. 3 values for the light mass and 2 values for the shadow mass. It's just a coincidence, but my light mass colors for my bricks are almost the same color as the imprimatur with a little bit of wipeout glaze on it. So it might be a little hard for you to tell that I'm actually covering this surface with paint. I'm careful to gradate from lighter to darker as I travel away from the edges of the brick. I actually started on these bricks with my number 2 value, not my number 1. I have moved on to the number 3 value. I'm trying to get a little darker on this brick as it goes further down on the surface. My surface is still nice and wet from the wipeout glaze. Even in the areas that I wiped out, such as these, there's a little bit of dampness and it is helping with the application of the paint. I have the number 3 value right now and I'm starting to paint the lower bricks. You could see me jump back and forth from one brick to the next, but I'm using the number 3 value. Here, I'm just trying to ensure a good opaque coverage. I'm also making sure that I don't have any big globs of paint. I'm trying to keep the brush strokes fairly short. They don't have to go in one direction. As a matter of fact, you're a little better off if you don't have everything going in one direction, but rather mix it up. Here, I've actually mixed a little bit of my number 3 value with my number 4 value. I want the bricks to go a little bit darker as they go to the outside. Also, you'll see when I put it on that edge of the brick, it's the edge of the brick that's facing away from the light source, so I am darkening that just a little bit. I'm now going into the cast shadow. By the way, this is my number 4 value, so I've now moved into the shadow mass colors. I'm basically covering this entire cast shadow area with the number 4 value. Now I have picked up the number 5 value. It's the darkest shadow mass color that I have at this point. I'm going on that outside edge, which is facing away from the light source, and I'm also adding that darker color just as the shadow mass comes right up under the pears. A cast shadow is darker when it's closer to the form that's casting it. The dark areas that I'm working on now are part of the rough texture of this particular brick. I'm making sure that I've got complete coverage on the bricks. It can be a little hard to tell because the brick color is so close to what's under it. Now I'm going back with a number 1 value. It's my lightest light. I'm going just outside the cast shadows. That happens in real life. It's almost a halo effect. This number 1 value is certainly mixing with the slightly darker color that's under it, so it's not as light as it will be when I start hitting the edges of the bricks. Here, I'm going to do a little bit of tapping and blending. The edges of these cast shadows have got to be very soft. The more you tap, the softer the edges will be. Notice that every time I lower my brush, what I'm doing is wiping the excess paint back out of the brush. It helps that it's an older brush and that the bristles are kind of splayed and fuzzy-ended. By the way, I'm using a number 4 filbert. Here, I'm starting to indicate the cast shadow from the stem. I'm just tapping the surface of the paint on the brick in order to make sure that there aren't any lumps or ridges that I don't want. I'm keeping my brush strokes very short and trying to keep them going in different directions. Now I've switched to the number 1 value. I wiped my brush out before loading it so that I would make sure that I'd got a very pure version of this number 1 value. It's my highlight on these bricks. I'm using it along the tops of the bricks, and I'm using it on the side of the brick where it's facing most toward the light. I don't want to do any blending of this lightest light because I really need it to indicate the texture of the brick. I am using a number 2 filbert. Here, I'm going to skip over the top area of the brick where I want the cast shadow from the stem to fall. Every time I lower my brush, I'm loading it with more of the number 1 value. I'm using the number 1 brick value here and on the edge to indicate a rough area in the brick. This little area of texture I wound up not keeping. I blended it in later. Here, I'm going back and hitting that lightest area right between those 2 cast shadows. I'll definitely soften and blend, as you can see here, but it does really help. Again, I'm lightening the side of the brick that faces most directly toward the light source. Now I'll add the mortar. I'm only working with one light and one dark value. I'm starting with the darker of the two values. Technically, this is shadow mass. Now I'm moving to the lighter of the two values. This is the light mass. I'll be doing a lot of blending from the lighter to the darker value as I go. Initially, I thought I wanted the mortars to be at two different levels, one to be slightly lower than the other. I didn't like the way it looked, and so I raised the one on the left to be close to the same level as the one on the right. I'm hitting the light value again, and you'll see that this makes it even lighter, and it looks a little more dimensional, as if one side of the mortar is slightly shadowed by the brick to the right. Here, I'm lightening the reflected light areas in the shadow mass on the pears using just yellow ochre. As I mentioned before, this will lighten the area and it will warm it up just a bit. The two upper pears have a lot of reflected light. The one that's down low, not so much. I'm also doing a little bit of blending at the edges of these reflected light areas. Be careful that your reflected lights are never quite as light as anything happening in the light mass. Now I'll paint the stems. I only have one light stem color and one dark stem color. I'm starting with the lighter of the two stem colors. Now I'm adding the shadow mass to each of the stems. Even though they're small, it does matter. I've added a little black to my darkest pear color. I'm going into the very darkest areas of the pear, which will cause the form to recede even more. I'm using more of this even darker color in a couple of areas on the other pear as well. Here, I'm adding an even lighter stem color. That's all I'll do for today.